Shalom, shalom. You're listening to Live Internet Studies. This is episode number 294. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Let's open with a quick word of prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, thank you for bringing us through the Purim season or celebration. Now we're ready to jump right into Passover, the season of our deliverance, the season of our freedom. And it is with expectation that we know that you've promised that if we meet you where you're at, you'll be there. You won't be absent. These are some of the reasons why you've given us these special days on the calendar. You've explained to your people, starting with Israel and then bringing in the multitudes of Gentiles in time, that I'm giving you a time where I want to meet with you. Set your calendars. I'll be there. Question is, are you going to be there? That's what you're saying to us. So thank you, Lord, for these times that speak of your presence, that speak of your redemption, that demonstrate the fullness of the messianic redemption that is found, the salvation that's found exclusively in your Son, Messiah, Yeshua. Help us to have the right heart attitude as we move into this particular season. Thank you for the studies that are in front of us. Give us a heart to understand quite difficult topics that we're looking at. And I'll be careful, Lord, to give you the praise and glory, B'Shem Yeshua. Amen. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for these live internet studies. Once again, we took a week break for the Purim time frame, the festival, and now we're ready to jump back in. So we're like a week behind, it feels like sometimes. I feel like I have to do catch-up, but I'm not going to do a lot of review and things like that. I'm only going to encourage you to go back to previous studies and look at what you've missed. Go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/ Tetze Torah Ministries, all one word, TETZETORAH.com. I'm sorry, not .com. TETZETORAH, and then the word ministries, right? There we go, all spelled out. Of course, if you're watching this video on YouTube, you're already aware of my YouTube channel, I hope. Let's jump into our studies. The entire hour-and-a-half long study for the live internet studies is 2 segments. First segment is entitled Eschatology, a Biblical Study of End-Time Events, where we're talking about things related to end-time prophecy. We're working our way towards the book of Revelation. The second segment is 30 minutes. It's entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism. That's where we look at Trinitarian versus Unitarian biblical passages. Which ones are correct? Is God Trinity? Is God unity? Those are the topics we look at. Okay, let's jump into topic 1. Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're working our way down through the chart that you're seeing on your screen right now. We're in topic 12, Rapture Views, a final analysis. We left off in the middle of working our way through this internet article put together by gotquestions.org, and they're asking this question: what are the strengths and weaknesses of the mid-tribulational view of the rapture, otherwise known as mid-tribulationism? And we actually read their article, and now we've already turned to my own evaluation. I entitled it, A Pre-Rapture Evaluates Mid-Tribulationism. So I have my own particular view of rapture, but let me just show you the 4 views that are kind of comparing and contrasting against one another. So give me a moment, jump over to a different screen here. I'm going to test drive a new way to show you on screen what I'm looking at. I wasn't quite happy with the old pointer, the little where I can draw on screen. I thought, you know what, I've got an iPad. Why don't I just put this thing to good use? Because it's got some really nice drawing features on it. So what I'm going to do is let me show you. Well, hold on. Let me do it this way. Let me show you the 4 different views real quick that are available at any given time that I'm working from. Let's see. So we've got in the upper. Let me bring this up a little bit. In the upper left corner, let's start out with the pre-trib rapture. You can see it. I just highlighted it in red there. The pre-trib rapture is the most popular view in circles, Christian circles these days. And basically, let me just read this little exclamation down here at the bottom. The pre-trib rapturers believe that the church will be raptured before this final 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. And so they've got their rapture up here in the upper left corner that I just circled. And it's in relationship to this giant, the entire 70th week, which is the entire week-long section. They believe that the church is going to be raptured prior to that. Their second coming is over here on the far right side, which is at the very end of the week. So this means that Christians will not go through the tribulation, nor will Christians go through the great tribulation. All of it is God's wrath. And so from their perspective, God's going to rescue us before any of the super bad stuff happens. That's their perspective. All right, let's keep going, though. There's another view. Mid-trib rapture, that's the one we're kind of discussing tonight. So we've got the mid-trib rapture up here. Oops, give me a second. My iPad slid out from underneath me. The mid-trib rapture in the upper right-hand corner, but I zoomed it in for you so you can't tell right now. But this particular rapture view, let me read the little description just down here at the bottom. The mid-trib rapturists believe that the rapture will occur exactly halfway through the 7-year period, just before the beginning of the Great Tribulation. So when they say Great Tribulation, they like the pre-tribbers, they think that the entire week is God's. They believe that the entire week is what we call the tribulation period. They break it up into two portions. They've got the tribulation period in the front half, then they've got what they call the Great Tribulation in the second half, and their rapture takes place right in the middle of both of them. And that's why they call themselves mid-trib, which means from their perspective, they do have Christians going into the tribulation, right? They've got some tribulation entry for Christians, unlike the pre-tribbers. However, because of the really bad tribulation over here, Christians don't have to go through that. That's why the rapture takes place just before God's wrath. So in some ways, they are kind of pre-wrath, just like pre-tribbers have Christians excused from wrath as well. But again, we're going to be discussing more about this particular view tonight. So don't worry if you're not quite following everything right now. Let's look at the one that was in the lower. It's kind of in the lower left corner until I've zoomed in. Let me get this guy out of the way for a second. This is known as the post-tribulation rapture. And this particular view is fairly popular, especially if you have ditched the pre-trib rapture and you're just not convinced about pre-trib or anything like that. Like the post-tribbers and the mid-tribbers, they take this entire week and give it over to a period that they call tribulation. And in other words, they're recognizing what is popularly termed a 7-year tribulation, where God's wrath occupies everything in the week. In this particular case, they've got their classic tribulation at the very beginning, followed by a great tribulation at the second half of the week. However, in stark difference to any of the other views that we've looked at so far, their second coming and post-trib rapture are at the farthest end of everything. Give me a second. Let me get rid of that one for a second. They've got a second coming and a post-tribulation rapture at the farthest end, which means Christians have to go through everything there before being raptured. Everything has to be experienced by Christians. How does God gonna handle that? When there are other verses that seem to indicate that we're not supposed to go through any wrath, according to their perspective, God is going to kind of shelter us or protect us supernaturally, kind of like the way he did with the Israelites in the midst of Egypt during the plagues, something like that. All right, but there's one more view, and this view is the pre-wrath rapture. Let's get it on the screen there. And this view, this pre-wrath rapture, this is the view that I hold to myself. Let's just read the description down here that I'm highlighting in yellow. The pre-wrath rapturists believe the rapture will occur following the opening of the sixth seal of the book of Revelation. So what this means is that the church will experience severe persecution by the Antichrist, but will be snatched away, that is, raptured, before God begins to pour out his wrath during the day of the Lord. And notice that I didn't read this thing down here at the bottom for the post-tribbers, but they believe that the rapture will occur following the 7-year period known as Daniel's 70th week. So one thing that's really different from the three views versus the post-trib is that the post-tribs put the church into the tribulation period and put the church through the wrath. But by comparison, the pre-wrath rapture, let's try that again. The pre-wrath raptures, right, the one that I'm holding to there, put a little star on it, huh? We believe that we do go through the tribulation period, meaning the Great Tribulation, right? So we've got the church entering into that. But the first part is not called the tribulation period. The first part is called the beginning of sorrows, the first part of the 70th week. And the day of the Lord is this part here, and I'm circling or making into a square. This part of the far end, the day of the Lord, God's wrath, the second coming of Jesus, that's when the rapture happens. And it's that day of the Lord activity that we are spared from. It's the wrath of God that's poured out that we are not going to experience. And so this is important because from the pre-wrath perspective, it allows the church to go into the Great Tribulation, but we also experience God's promise of being spared from his own personal wrath as his bride. So, and the thing that separates those two is the rapture itself. And so that's why in our name, pre-wrath focuses on the fact that we're not going to go through the wrath of God. So when I look at all of these particular views and put them all back to, and I take all these views and look at them, I can see that there are some similarities between the views, and there are some differences between the views. And so I think it's important as we study along that we give credit where credit's due, no matter which view you look at. All of the views are operating from the biblical data that's available to us. What becomes our research homework assignment is how do we corroborate and collaborate and harmonize the different biblical data that sometimes look like it is opposing. I mean, look at the pre-wrath look at the pre-trib versus the post-trib. I mean, they're just like opposites, and yet only one of these views can be right unless there are actually two second comings, and one's at the very beginning of the 7 years and one's at the very end or something like that. Right? Two complete raptures is what I mean by that, not just two different second comings. So we'll talk about these in time. Let's jump over to my essay that I put together. A pre-rapture evaluates mid-tribulationism. So I'm not going to read through Biblical Unitarian. I'm not going to read through GotQuestions.org's essay right now. Instead, just know that I've already gone through it. And now we're ready to go into mine. So we already worked our way down through some of this. They're broken up into, I think, like 6 different paragraphs. Excuse me. And we already made our way through paragraph 1, so I don't need to read any of that anymore. We stopped basically at paragraph 2. So let's start here with paragraph 2 tonight and see what we can go through. The way I put this together is I put this big square around where GotQuestions.org, who is a pre-trib leaning outfit. They believe in pre-trib. But what they are doing at the moment is they are evaluating the mid-trib position, and then I, a pre-wrather, I'm evaluating GotQuestions.org's evaluation of the mid-trib position, and I'm agreeing in some places with GotQuestions, and in other times I'm disagreeing with GotQuestions perspective, but primarily what I'm doing as a pre-wrather is I'm providing my own comparison and contrast of the mid-trib position itself. So, GotQuestions.org. We're in paragraph 2 here. Look at the screen. Got questions. According to mid-tribulationism, the order of events in 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3 is as follows. Number 1, the apostasy. Number 2, the revealing of the Antichrist. And number 3, the day of Christ. And this basic order that they're describing is not in accordance with the way they see things lining up. Remember, if we go back over to, let's pull up a different slide this time. Let's go to the pre-trib rapture here. According to the pre-trib, give me a second, I want to drop this guy. I want this guy on the bottom. According to the pre-trib rapture, their rapture is going to take place way over here at the very beginning of the week, which means if you compare, right, the second coming from their perspective is way over here at the far end of the week. So what this does for them is it creates a completely separate event known as rapture that is separate, 7 years separate, from the event known as second coming. And in so doing, what this causes is the church to be disconnected from Israel by design. And you have to, the only way you can really follow along with the pre-trib rapture and the arguments that they present and the logic that they're working from is you have to remember that they use something known as dispensationalism. Dispensationalism. So this is dispensationalism. Dispensationalism, and I'm not digressing. There's a very important reason for this. Dispensationalism has, let's bring in my little markers. Dispensationalism has this kind of this church age over here. Oops, I don't want to do that. That's too big. They've got this church age that they describe, which is the age separate from Israel, from their perspective. There's this dispensation when God used to work with Israel, and now we're in this dispensation where God's working with the church. But I suppose where they believe we're at right now is that we're in the signs of the end of the time, of the end of days. But sooner or later, what's going to happen is this little 7-year time frame. It's kind of a bad drawing. Let's try that again. There we go. Capture all of it. This little 7-year tribulation. Sorry. This little 7-year tribulation is going to kick in a little. This 7-year tribulation is going to kick in. And when that happens, we're going to have a rapture that happens to remove the church from having to enter into any of what should be a time frame where God is dealing with Israel. And so the pre-tribulation rapture is built upon the foundation of dispensationalism. And this is going to be one of the main factors that separates it from some of those other three positions that I mentioned, right? Pre-tribulationism versus mid, post, and pre-wrath. Pre-tribulationism is proudly dispensationalist. So that's why I'm showing you this. Now, let's jump back over to Got Questions evaluation. Remember, they're going to evaluate they being pre-tribbers, which means they're dispensationalists. They're going to evaluate all the other positions as it lines up with their dispensational perspective of the church either going into the 70th week of Daniel, the 7-year tribulation that they call it, or the church being absent from that. And that's why when they begin to look at 2 Thessalonians 2, and they read things about the apostasy, the revealing of Antichrist, the day of Christ, they begin to say, where's the church in all this? And so they're going to say, the church is absent. The church is not in part of that. But they do recognize that the other positions place the church into the 70th week of Daniel, i.e. the 7-year tribulation. So they say, according to mid-tribulationism, the Antichrist will not be revealed until the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation. And so the reason this is relevant to us is we're going to see when I get into my own answer, my own response, is that pre-tribbers don't believe that Christians will, in fact, meet the Antichrist. What do we pre-wrathers say? Pre-wrath response number 1 to paragraph number 2. GodQuestions.org is once again simply representing or presenting mid-tribulationism's position at this point in their little essay without critique. They're not critiquing them, they're just telling you what the mid-tribbers believe. Pre-wrath actually agrees with mid-trib here on this one. Remember, I said that pre-wrath has some agreement with pre-trib. We're not completely in disagreement with them. Let me show you, bring up that that other chart one more time. When we look at this, give me a second, it's kind of busy. Let's get rid of all that stuff. Okay. If you look at all the four different positions here, then what I'm doing right now is I'm kind of comparing at the moment this view and this view. Okay? The mid-trib rapture says that there's a rapture right in the middle of what they call the 7-year tribulation. The pre-wrath, by comparison, puts our rapture a little farther into the weekly events or activities, but definitely past the midpoint, right? That midpoint is when the mid-trib rapture says that the rapture should take place. We pre-wrathers say, no, not quite. So let's keep going in my own little essay. But we pre-wrathers, we do agree with mid-trib that 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3 shows the rapture follows the revealing of the Antichrist. And this is an important distinction. When we go back over to my little chart here, I don't want to get rid of all of that. Let's just get rid of that. When you look at the pre-trib rapture over on the upper left corner of the screen, and they've got their rapture way over at the very beginning, notice they are excusing the church from seeing any Antichrist activity. In fact, according to this chart, I don't see where they have the Antichrist showing up. Does he show up at the midpoint of the week? Does he show up over at the beginning of the week? Where does the Antichrist show up? I don't know. I have to check into their position one more time and see what they have to say. But either way, they don't really make it an issue, the pre-tribbers. They don't make it an issue because they don't believe that the church is going to see the Antichrist. By comparison, like I mentioned, the pre-trib rapture has Antichrist. They're going to... now, does he show up here at the beginning of the week? No. I think they're going to say that he shows up here at the midpoint of the week, makes his grand entrance, the Antichrist, he shows up then, but the church gets raptured either just before he shows up or right after he shows up. Either way, what they have, remember, is they've got their great tribulation kicking off at the midpoint and occupying the entire second half of the 7th week. By comparison, we pre-wrathers, we do have the Antichrist showing up in the middle of the week. Well, actually, we're going to find out that he makes his debut at the beginning of the week, but he makes a big splash at the middle of the week, right? So, but this means that we Christians go through the Great Tribulation. We go through that, only to be raptured halfway through or so. Sometime I'm not saying exactly halfway through, but let's look at our comparison. We do agree that 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 to 3 shows the rapture following the revealing of the Antichrist. But I'm going to start pulling away from the mid-tribbers here at this point. However, mid-trib assumes the Antichrist is fully revealed only at the midpoint of Daniel's 7th week. In reality, I believe that his rise begins earlier with a 7-year covenant, Daniel 9:27. But his full blasphemous reign starts at the midpoint of Daniel 11. At the midpoint of the week. You can read this in Daniel 11, Revelation 13:5 through 10. So when I go back over to this particular chart, yes, then we can see that Antichrist shows up here at the beginning of the week, but we might not know that he's Antichrist. We might not know. But here's the thing that I think that we will know, and this is something that prophecy students and teachers kind of debate. Will we know when the 7-year peace treaty is signed? I believe that we will, and the reason I believe we will, it seems obvious to me. I could be wrong, but when we're talking about the 7-year peace treaty, that the Antichrist is going to, we could even call it a peace experiment. I think Ron Wallace calls it that. 7-year peace experiment, because it has to be something that allows Israel and her surrounding Arab and Muslim neighbors to get along with each other. It at least facilitates some sort of ceasefire agreement. At the very least, it's going to have that going on. But in order for it to be effectual and most beneficial for Israel, Israel needs to be able to start doing sacrifices on some sort of Temple Mount or temple structure or something to that effect. And so that's why I believe it won't be invisible to the world. I mean, honestly, right now, if Israel resumed sacrifices on the Temple Mount, that is absolutely not going to be invisible to the world. That's going to be like world headlines everywhere in the world. Christians are certainly going to sit up in their seat and say, what in the world? Animal sacrifices? Then they're going to start protesting, Jesus, Jesus, right? We don't need animal sacrifices. But you get my point, is that I don't believe that particular activity will go unnoticed. There's just, I don't see how there's any way that the news stories around the world won't be covering Israel having sacrifices on the Temple Mount, and the Muslims aren't going into World War III mode about it, right? The authorities on the Temple Mount aren't forbidding that. So that's why I think that the 7-year peace experiment, again, those are Ron Wallace's terms when I say peace experiment. I think that's why we might not know who Antichrist is, but the fact that these activities will begin will cause prophecy students to go, wait a minute, didn't we read something in the Bible about Israel resuming their sacrifices and what that means for end time prophecy, Book of Revelation, Daniel 70th week? They're gonna start clicking and putting all the pieces together in their head. So that's kind of what's going on. However, let's keep reading. Pre-wrath also holds that the rapture occurs after the Great Tribulation begins, but is cut short. I say also, meaning we pre-wrathers believe that Christians are going to go through some tough times. The mid-tribbers, let me go back over to this chart for a second. The mid-tribbers have, let me get rid of some of that stuff. The mid-tribbers have the church going through the tribulation period, but it's not the Great Tribulation period. It's the first 3.5 years. But by their reckoning, the Great Tribulation, which is the second half of the week, the church gets raptured before that, right? So they've got this rapture here that the church is excused from. And so in this way, the mid-tribbers kind of resemble the pre-tribbers in that they don't believe that the church is going to go through any tribulation. And yet, similar to the pre-wrathers and the post-tribbers, the mid-tribbers do believe that the church is going to go through some tough times. You remember, the pre-trib rapture says, no, we're not going to go through anything. God's going to rescue us before any tribulation and before any great tribulation, right? We're excused from both of those things. All right. So let's keep looking at my little essay here. Paragraph number 2 continued. So gotquestions.org is continuing into their evaluation of mid-tribulationism. Here's what they say. They believe that mid-tribulationism believes that Daniel 7:25 indicates the Antichrist will persecute the saints for 3.5 years, meaning the church is present for the first half of the 7-year tribulation period and removed before the worst part, viz. The second half. And so I demonstrated that here on the screen now. Tribulation period right here, Great Tribulation period over on the other side. And so the church has their rapture prior to any Great Tribulation, which means prior to any God's wrath. By the way, the mid-tribulation we're going to see this later on, but I'm just kind of hinting at it right now. The mid-tribulation puts their timing of the rapture in the middle of the week. to coincide with what they're going to call the seventh trumpet. And in so doing, the seventh trumpet is then identified as the last trumpet that Paul talked about. Now that's going to bear significance to help the mid-tribbers and the pre-wrathers kind of pull away from one another here in just a bit, but I wanted to kind of tip my hand to you a little early. Okay. What do we pre-wrathers have to say about what GotQuestions.org just said about mid-trib? GotQuestions.org finally begins to critique mid-tribulationism at this particular point in their essay. And what they do is they note its assumption that the church faces persecution in the first half of a so-called 7-year tribulation. The reason I said so-called there is because the pre-wrath position doesn't see the entire 7 years as a tribulation period. We instead, if you remember when I go back over here, we instead have this early part called the beginning of sorrows, that we borrow that language right from Jesus himself, right from Yeshua. The beginning of sorrows then is something that, yes, the 7-year peace treaty starts there, right? Remember with Antichrist, but the tribulation itself doesn't necessarily start at the 7-year period. What does the beginning of sorrows entail then? Well, there are lots of messy things that do take place on the earth. When I say messy, we're talking about bad stuff that happens to innocent people, bad stuff that happens to good people. But overall, the Antichrist doesn't seem to be on this hell-bent mission to take out Christians and Jews en masse just yet. That doesn't seem to be his focus. To be sure, his revelation won't have taken place yet. We might not even know that he's Antichrist. Even though the 7-year peace experiment, I believe, will be known to the world, but perhaps there will be some question and mystery around who, in fact, got this thing put together. Maybe he'll be operating incognito, right? He might just come right out in front and stand in front of the cameras like we've seen Bill Clinton do, like we've seen Trump do, like we've seen President Carter do, the late President Carter do. We've seen other presidents stand in front of the TV screen and they're flanked on either side by some Muslim Arab representative PLO person, Yasser Arafat or whoever on one side of them, and then an Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin or Bibi Netanyahu or somebody on the other side, and the U.S. president's right in the middle, and they're getting this agreement going on. This could be any number of quote unquote land for peace type of agreements that have always fallen apart, to include the latest one, the Abrahamic one that Trump tried to facilitate. But my point is, we pre-wrathers don't see a need to call this first 3.5 years the tribulation period, because the Bible doesn't use that term. It uses the term beginning of sorrows. And it sounds like we're nitpicking, but there's a reason why we're doing that. And part of it has to do with the fact that the church goes into that period, and that entire period doesn't need to be dispensationally separated away from the church, such as the pre-tribbers do. So, the 7-year tribulation period, the so-called, pre-wrath agrees that believers will endure persecution under the Antichrist, but rejects mid-trib's timing of that persecution. Mid-tribbers, remember, put the rapture and timing starting at the midpoint. Well, let me go back over to the chart for a second. There is some similarities here. All right, I need to highlight this. Let's remove some of these things here. Start from clean from this side. All right. In this chart, in the mid-trib, starting at the midpoint, that's where we're going to find our rapture. By comparison, pre-wrath has our rapture over here a little farther into the week. So notice that in the pre-wrath position, the Great Tribulation begins at the midpoint, but it's cut short by the rapture itself. That rapture circle is a little too big. Let's shrink that down to about like that. There we go. So the Great Tribulation is cut short by the pre-wrath rapture in our particular model. And in the mid-trib model, it begins at the midpoint of the week. But why this is important, one distinction is the mid-trib model has the Great Tribulation running the entire length of the last 3.5 years. And yes, we pre-tribbers do agree that there will be tribulation during that time, but we don't need to call it Great Tribulation. And again, we're not nitpicking on the terms. It's because God has, on the one hand, given 3.5 years over to Satan to rule via his puppet named Antichrist. But at the same time, Yeshua came along and gave extra information at Matthew 24, starting about verse 21 and 22, where he said, but those days will be cut short for the sake of the elect. And if those days weren't cut short, then no flesh would survive this great tribulation period. So this is where we pre-wrathers begin to disagree or differentiate. It's kind of a unique feature of the pre-wrath rapture to have this tribulation period cut short. The post-tribbers don't do any of that. They just have everybody going through everything. Nothing's cut short. The pre-tribbers, right, they don't have anything cut short. They just have their great tribulation taking place after their tribulation period. There's nothing cut short. And the second coming happens at the far end of the week, but it's not cut short by any rapture. Remember, the rapture is way over here. So it's really kind of signature to the pre-wrath view that we've got this great tribulation that is cut short by the pre-wrath rapture itself. Let's go back over to the chart. So, GodQuestions.org finally begins to critique mid-tribulationism, noting its assumption that the church faces a persecution in the first half of a so-called 7-year tribulation. Pre-wrath says, yeah, we agree that believers will endure persecution under the Antichrist, but we reject the timing that the timing of the persecution. In other words, we don't think that the persecution is going to last for Christians, that's going to last the entire length of the 3.5 years because of Jesus' words that the Great Tribulation is going to be cut short by something. Let's keep going. Point number two that I make is, unlike mid-trib, remember, this is a pre-wrath critique of the mid-trib position that was presented by GodQuestions.org, and they are a pre-trib position themselves. Unlike mid-trib and pre-trib, pre-wrath, notice how I'm separating us, we pre-wrathers, from the mid-tribbers and the pre-tribbers. We call the first half of Daniel's 70th week the beginning of birth pangs. This is what I just mentioned, but now you're getting it in my essay version. Right, go back to Matthew 24:8. While this period, Revelation 6:1-8, brings global turmoil, Christians and Jewish persecution begins closer to the midpoint. And this is something, again, that I don't know if the other three positions make this big push to explain that the tribulation period itself, how do I say this? The tribulation, what they call the tribulation period, what the other three call the tribulation period, doesn't have any focus on Christians and Jews until we get the Antichrist revealing himself at the midpoint of the week. And that seems to be what Yeshua says most pointedly in his Olivet Discourse, essays, his Olivet Discourses to the disciples. Now, you also have to remember that the words that Jesus gave to his disciples that day, when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and things like that, it had a near far application to it first. When Jesus gave these words to his disciples in Matthew, Mark, and Luke Olivet Discourses, he explained that a tough time is coming, and you as my disciples are going to go into this tough time. You're going to be persecuted specifically because you bear my name. And within this time period of persecution, there will be eventually, Jerusalem will be surrounded. There'll be this destruction of the temple, etc., etc. So part of what Jesus talked about was applicable to the first century, and they needed to see that. That's what we call near far. The near-term application of what he was saying was applicable to them right then. They would see this destruction. It would happen within a short time after Yeshua left planet Earth. And so they could understand that. But at the same time, the verses now, that has been 2,000 years ago, those verses now apply to a future time period. So we say near and far. Far from them is the application that is still around the corner, still future to us as well. Now, I bring that up because we talk about Christian and Jewish persecution begins closer to the midpoint. At the time that Jesus spoke those words to the disciples, they didn't have all the details that we now do have with the 70th week as spelled out in the book of Revelation. To be sure, when he was speaking to them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it was earlier in the in the first century, and John hadn't even received the book of Revelation yet. So we didn't have all the details that we kind of now know we can look back at and put a lot of timing on this together. Realize, wow, midpoint of the week, things are going to start heating up. Antichrist is going to do this. He's going to have a short time period. Blah blah blah. We get a lot more detail now, more than they actually had. Okay, point number 3. Scripture places the Antichrist's reign and persecution in the second half of the 70th week, right? Read Daniel, read Matthew, read Revelation. These saints, this is very important, by the way, these saints endure the great tribulation. That's why I put it in bold. They endure the great tribulation, which Jesus said would come before the cosmic signs and the rapture. So this is the 7th week of Daniel. One more time. This is a pre-wrath view of the 7th week of Daniel. Remember, we've got our full 7 years, like you can see on the screen. I don't need to draw that. We've got our full 7 years. But then, if you notice down along the bottom, we've got all these different arrows pointing up that correspond to the different seals that are going to be happening. And one of those seals is the 6th seal, which brings in the coming of the Son of Man. So that's the rapture. But notice that the rapture and the day of the Lord activities, all of this stuff right here, notice that all of that is separated away from the Great Tribulation by the presence of 6th seal, which then leads right into the rapture. And so the point I'm trying to bring up at this particular juncture is that even though the rapture is unknown, it will be signaled by the 6th seal sign. And so we don't know when the 6th seal will take place. In fact, when it takes place, we won't know perhaps that it's number 6. But we will be we as Christians, we should be, if we're alive during that time, we should be aware that if we're in the middle of the Great Tribulation, right, we're being persecuted and hunted for our very lives by Antichrist, we should be aware of the promises that Yeshua gave us, both in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we need to be expecting his rescue. We need to be expecting, all of the rapture views, all 4 of them, have Jesus returning to rescue his bride. It's just a difference of when does this rescue take place. So if we're in the middle of a tribulation, then we need to keep our heads up. We need to. In fact, I want to actually show this reference because this is something that Yeshua brought out in the book of Luke. Yeah, this is the verse I want. I want verse 28 of Luke 21. But when these things begin to take place, right, and I believe that the context of these things is, if we go back up, we'll see, we can just put the context right here, starting at verse 25. There'll be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress among nations, and perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. People fainting from fear at the expectation of the things that are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. What is this verse 25 referring to? Going back to our chart, I believe it is referring to the 6th seal, at least part of it, because it talks about the sun going dark, the moon going red color like blood, and the stars like meteorites falling from the sky. In fact, the Greek word there is the word where we get our word asteroid, asteros. Like they look like asteroids falling from the sky. I believe that will be one of the signs, if not the sign, of the second coming. And following on the heels of verse 25 and 26 here in Luke 21, Yeshua says in verse 27, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. I believe verse 27 is the rapture. Contrary to the pre-tribbers who think that this is the second coming, not the rapture, I as a pre-raptor interpret verse 27 as the rapture. And it's from there that verse 28, Yeshua says, but when these things, so that's the context. What are these things? These things prior to his coming, that he just mentioned in verse 27, must immediately at least be the signs of verse 25 and 26. The sun, moon, stars, earth in distress, roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting from fear, blah, 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 the powers of the heavens being shaken. I believe that's the immediate context of these things. And here's the promise. When these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads, because your redemption, what is that redemption? That redemption, I take it to be the rapture, your redemption. So, going back over to my my commentary here, the saints endure the great tribulation, which Jesus said would come before the cosmic signs and the rapture. So in the order, going from what we were talking about earlier in 2 Thessalonians, we've got Antichrist showing up, and then we've got this great tribulation that happens, and then we've got these cosmic signs that show up, and then we've got the rapture. So if we go back and look at the chart, we can see it like this. We've got the Antichrist making a covenant way over here at the beginning of the week, but then we've got a number of things that start to take place. Remember, this time period here is, we can call that the beginning of sorrows. This first 3.5 years here that I've just put a little square around. But we've got some persecution that's going to start heating up around this point in time. But it's not until the Antichrist is revealed at the midpoint of the week with the abomination of desolation that the great tribulation is going to kick off. So that's why this thing right here in the middle is going to, that I'm coloring yellow, is going to be very, I think, obvious to Christians. It's actually the revealing of the Son of Man. Sorry, not the Son of Man. The Son of Perdition. The revealing of the Son of Perdition. The Antichrist has his own parousia, his coming, the coming of the Son of destruction. The abomination of desolation is his grand entry onto planet Earth. It's when he takes his disguise off and reveals to everyone in the world, boo, right? Aha! I'm not the man of peace. I'm your worst nightmare, right? Worship me as God or die, right? He's going to impose the mark of the beast, and he's going to turn on Christians and Jews en masse. He's going to set up this abominable idol, statue, or whatever, something like that effect in the temple. Remember what I said earlier. The Jews, per the peace experiment that they signed at the beginning of the week, will be doing their animal sacrifices on top of the Temple Mount, right there next to the Muslim Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and all that other Muslim stuff that's up there right now. Somehow this peace experiment, orchestrated by the Antichrist, perhaps in view of everyone or behind the scenes, we don't know. But either way, there will be this kind of allowance for the Jews to have their sacrifices going on. But at the middle of the week, then Antichrist is going to turn on them and say, no more. Daniel describes it as putting an end to sacrifices, things like that. So this will spell a lot of trouble for Christians and Jews. Per Revelation chapter 12, Jews will have to run into hiding. Jesus told them, if you're in Jerusalem, flee, get out of there. Revelation 12 tells us that there's a place in the desert prepared for the last 3.5 years for Israel. That's going to take place as well. The mark of the beast will be implemented at that point in time. Oh, something else that'll happen. The two witnesses should show up on the scene. Yeah, wow. All kinds of supernatural activity. But we still don't have the sixth seal sign, not at the middle of the week. And that's one of the reasons why the mid-trib position starts to fall apart, because Jesus seems to place his second coming immediately after the sixth seal signals that he's going to arrive on planet Earth. But the mid-tribbers have Jesus showing up at the midpoint of the week after what they call the seventh trumpet. Right, so they got some weird things going on with their timing of seals and trumpets that we'll have to talk about later on. Let's go back over to my little essay here. We've got plenty of time. I feel like I'm running out of time, but when I look at my clock, in fact, let me jump over to it because I'm dumbfounded that I've got 15 minutes left, and I feel like, wow, okay, well, let's just keep going then. Let's read this part. God questions. We're in paragraph number 3. God questions says, mid-tribulationism teaches that the trumpet of 1 Corinthians 15:52 is the same as the seventh trumpet of Revelation 11:15. Let me pause for a moment. Oh, didn't want to go there. Wanted to go here. The post-tribbers also believe that the seventh trumpet. Let's go back up to this slide. The post-tribbers also believe that the second coming of Christ, let me bring up my little drawing tool. They believe, let's get rid of some, no, we want to keep that. The post-tribbers believe that the second coming is at the very end of the week. So I'm right here in my little slide here. So I'm describing this second coming period over here. And they believe that this coincides with what they're going to call the seventh trumpet, which is also the same as the last trumpet. This is what post-tribbers believe. By comparison, the pre-wrathers don't put the rapture at the seventh trumpet, but we do, and listen very carefully, we pre-wrathers do believe that the seventh trumpet is at the end of the 70th week, just like the post-tribbers. So we have the timing of the trumpet at the same, but there's two big differences. Number one, we don't put the rapture at the seventh trumpet. And number two, we don't conflate the word seventh trumpet with the phrase last trumpet. However, the mid-tribbers do conflate the seventh trumpet with the last trumpet, but they don't put that trumpet happening at the end of the week. They put that seventh trumpet as happening in the middle of the week. Are you following along? So they've got some really big differences. It's, again, we're all working from the same resource. We're all working from the Bible, the pre-tribs, the mid-tribs, the post-tribs, the pre-wrath. So I am absolutely not throwing anyone under the bus for their rapture position. I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. Your rapture position is not what's going to save you in the end times. It's not going to save you at the end of days. It's not the fact that you figured out the timeline and you know when Jesus is going to come back, that's why you're saved. No, just get that out of your head. You need to have a personal relationship with Jesus himself. Otherwise, you're going to miss him when he comes back. You're going to go headlong into all the mess and you're going to be scratching your head going, I thought I had it all figured out. I even got the timing of the rapture right, but I missed it. Why did I miss it? Because you missed the Messiah. You have to have a relationship with him, okay? Get your eyes focused on Jesus and not focused on throwing all the other rapture positions under the bus because they don't believe with your clever position. So let's not do that. So the mid-tribbers believe that the trumpet of 1 Corinthians 15:52, that's where Paul says at the last trump. They believe it's the same as the seventh because they look at, and it's kind of deduction for them, right? Just like, by the way, the post-tribbers do the same thing. They look at the seven trumpets and they count them, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when they get to the seventh, they're like, is there an eighth trumpet? And their answer is no. Therefore, when Paul said seventh trumpet, when Paul said last trumpet, maybe the Holy Spirit was beaming this information that he was going to give to John later on. Paul called it last trumpet. John called it seventh trumpet, and, look, wow, by coincidence, a miracle of miracles, they happen to be the same trumpet. You can hear by the sarcasm in my voice that I don't hold to this particular logic, but I absolutely could be wrong. I'm just not convinced that it's right. I think it's a bit anachronistic, and I'll talk a bit about that in my essay answer here. So, GotQuestions.org soundly rejects this logic, and in our opinion, in their opinion, we call this a failure in our, meaning we, pre-wrathers believe. We call this a failure in view of the trumpet's objectives. The trumpet that, and in our failure, God questions speaking, all right? So I'm like right here right now. God questions soundly rejects its logic, and in our opinion, this is them talking. We call this a quote. This is God questions quote. That's why I put it in quotes. We call this a failure in view of the trumpet's objectives. So listen very carefully as to why pre-trib, aka God questions at this point in time, as to why they reject the idea that the rapture is A, at the seventh trumpet, and B, why it is synonymous with the last trump and things like that. Failure in view of the trumpet's objectives. This is what God Questions says. The trumpet that sounds at the rapture is, quote, the trumpet call of God, end quote. Read 1 Thessalonians 4:16. But the one in Revelation 11 is a harbinger of judgment. Okay, notice what they're saying here. I think has some traction. Even though I'm not a pre-tribber, I'm on board with what they're trying to say here. They believe that the trumpets are, I guess, let me go like that so you can see all of it. The trumpet that sounds at the rapture is a trumpet call of God, and the one in Revelation is a harbinger of judgment. One trumpet is a call of grace to God's elect. The other is a pronouncement of doom on the wicked. And honestly, I think that's a pretty good explanation of the differences between the two trumpets. Now, again, the pre-tribbers could be wrong here. Remember, God Questions is a pre-trib. That's why they're explaining this position. They could be wrong too. I mean, the trumpets could have some overlap there, but that's, I think, pretty good information to lock onto. Let's begin to read my response. Response number 1, pre-wrath response. Associating the rapture with the seventh trumpet of Revelation is a misplaced assumption also made by post-tribulationism. That's what I just mentioned earlier. What do I go on to say? Pre-wrath asserts, and yes, I say asserts, because how can I confidently say that I'm right and they're wrong? In the end, all of us are making assertions, assumptions, presuppositions, interpretations. We're doing the best with what we've got as far as the biblical text, which we're all working from the same resources. Okay, so yes, pre-wrath asserts that this trumpet in Revelation 11:15 is not the rapture, but an announcement of Christ's coming reign near or at the end of the seventh week. And I didn't mention anything about the seventh trumpet coinciding with Israel's salvation near the end of the week, but we'll get to that in time. I just didn't want to dump all that into this particular explanation right now. But we pre-wrathers also believe that when Paul says in Romans chapter 11, around verse 25, 26, 27, that all Israel will be saved, or he's talking about the end of the age of the Gentiles, the fullness of the Gentiles is coming in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. I believe that is around the seventh trumpet / end of the seventh week time frame, something like that. But I don't want to get into that right now. Let's take it point number 2 under my response. This is a pre-wrath response to talking about the seventh trumpet and the last trumpet being synonymous. So we pre-wrathers reject that. We reject the conflating, the overlapping of the terms, last trumpet with seventh trumpet. We also reject the timing that mid-trib asserts that this trumpet, the seventh trumpet, is blown at the midpoint of the week. We reject that as well. In fact, all the other three positions reject that. The pre-tribbers put the seventh trumpet at the end of the seventh week. The post-tribbers put the seventh trumpet at the end of the seventh week. And we pre-wrathers also put let me just jump over to the chart. All three of us, the pre, the post, and the pre-wrath, we all put the trumpet at the very end. So let me go like this. Oops, I don't want to do that. Let's go like this. Let's draw an arrow there. And let's draw another arrow there. And so what I'm saying is that this is that seventh trumpet, right? That's the arrows that I'm showing you are showing you where the pre and the post and the pre-wrath, the pre-trib, the post-trib, and the pre-wrath, we all put that seventh trumpet. Sorry, that's actually not quite right. We should put it all the way at the very end there. kind of like that. That's where I'm going to put the seventh trumpet, way down there at the very end. But the mid-trib, where's theirs? There we go. That's where they're going to put theirs. They're going to say, oh no, this trumpet's right there at the beginning, which means all their great tribulation stuff is all of the vials, the seven. You're like, what happens to the bowls? All of these are the bowls. They're way up there. That's where they're at the very end. Okay, can you read my handwriting there? Okay. All right, so instead of this last trumpet in 1 Corinthians, instead of the last trumpet and the seventh trumpet being the same thing, what we hereafter say is that instead, the last trumpet in 1 Corinthians 15:52 and the trump of God in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 refer to the great trumpet of Matthew 24:31, which is tied to the resurrection and gathering of the saints. So notice I'm putting three trumpet passages together. 1 Corinthians 15:52, right? That's the last trump language that Paul used. Trump of God, 1 Thessalonians 4:16, and great trumpet, Matthew 24:31. All three of those are definitely a trumpet event, and the 1 Corinthians 15:52 and 1 Thessalonians 4:16 are unmistakably resurrection passages, which then overlaps them or turns them into rapture passages at the same time, because rapture and resurrection are tied together, and they happen in that order: resurrection, then rapture. And so that's unmistakable as well. And then all three of them become what are going to be known by Yeshua, in fact, which originated with Yeshua, as gather passages. And the reason we know that is because the gather language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 is picked up by Paul in his Thessalonian letters at 2 Thessalonians, when he talks about the coming of the Lord and our gathering, being gathered together to him. He uses that word gather there, which is a form of the Greek word where we get our word synagogue from, synagoge or something to that effect, episynagoge or something, gathering together, synagogue. So we've got this language tying all of these three trumpet events together. But what we don't have in all of those three is any mention of a seventh trumpet, nor do we have any mention of the activities that are associated with the seventh trumpet when we get to the last book of the Bible, which is the book of Revelation. So I say that, again, the last trumpet in 1 Corinthians 15:52, the trumpet of God in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, and the great trumpet of Matthew 24:31, they are all tied to the resurrection and gathering of the saints. Paul likely drew his rapture trumpet association from Jesus' prophecy. So what that means is, the reason I reject it being connected to the seventh trumpet, and I'm going to say this now here, is that the seventh trumpet, by comparison, is part of Revelation's judgment sequence and does not describe a resurrection. There's no resurrection language in that Revelation 7th trumpet sequence. However, I know what my objectors are going to say, my detractors, those who object, they're going to go, wait a minute, Ariel. At the very end of Revelation chapter around 20, John describes this first resurrection. And if that coincides with being at the very end of the 70th week, then wouldn't that coincide with the resurrection that Paul and Jesus and everybody else is talking about? And since the timing of the very end of the 70th week is the seventh trumpet, wouldn't that be the resurrection? Okay. From a face value view, it looks that way. I'll have to get into more of that later, but I don't want to jump into it right now. But suffice to say that a very short answer would be that what John is describing there is an overview of the 70th week events, because he's going to start moving into millennium events, and he needs to bring the readers up to speed with what's the very last main event that took place as in terms of God's people moving from earth to be with Jesus and then being able to go into the millennium. It was the resurrection event that changed our bodies so that we can go into the millennium and be with Jesus, etc., etc. But I'll get into more of that later. I go on to say my answer this way, short answer. We're almost done with our study here. The seventh trumpet is part of Revelation's judgment sequence and does not describe a resurrection. Paul's last trumpet relates to resurrection, not the judgments of Revelation. So, resurrection is the last trump. Resurrection is the great trumpet. Resurrection is the trumpet of God, like we saw earlier. Last trumpet, 1 Corinthians. Trump of God, 1 Thessalonians. Great trumpet, Matthew. But seventh trumpet belongs to the book of Revelation. And so I bring kind of like a semi-conclusion, and this is a perfect place to end because we're going to be poised for paragraph 4 next week. So the conclusion to this, paragraph 3 about the seventh trumpet. The seventh trumpet announces Christ's reign and God's intensified wrath, but it is not the rapture. The rapture occurs earlier, after the sixth seal's cosmic disturbances, and before God's wrath even begins. The seventh trumpet leads into the bowl judgments and Christ's second coming. And so we're not going to be able to explain these trumpets completely for now, but I do want to give you a kind of a sneak preview of maybe what some of them might look like. Give me a second. Okay, let's jump over to the slides. So we've got 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls in this particular slide. Notice that seal number 7 initiates the 7 trumpets themselves, and then the 7th trumpet itself initiates the 7 bowls. So let me bring up my little tool here. I'm not going to get deep into this, but just know that for now, I believe that the rapture should take place around this particular spot. Maybe don't want to draw a circle. Maybe want to draw just an X. Somewhere right in this area. Okay. That's the rapture. That's a poor looking. So we'll call that rapture somewhere there. But then notice that the 6th and 7th seal are not to be equated with the 6th or the 7th trumpet. And by the way, the fact that trumpet number 1 is over here does not mean that it relates to trumpet number 4 over here. Don't get confused and think that that's what's going on. It's just trying to say that all of the trumpets are collapsed inside of inside of seal number 7, but they still have to be played out sequentially in a direction that moves them away from the 7th trumpet. And then likewise, when we get to trumpet number 7, we get all of the bowls that are contained therein, but they also lead in a direction away from the trumpet so that we have some sequencing going on. But again, let me wipe out all of that for a second. What I'm saying is that the rapture that takes place around here is not to be equated with the end of the week, which takes place about here, right? That would be about the end of the 70th week is at that particular point in time. So we could then begin to, no, I don't want to show you that. I don't want to show you that. I don't want to show you that. Okay. That's probably good enough. We'll eventually get into some of this. I got more charts that show differences, comparisons, and contrasts between seals, trumpets, and bowls, and another one that shows more information about seals, trumpets, and bowls. But there's no need to get into that right now. Let's just draw our study to a close with the conclusion about the 7th trumpet announcing Christ's reign. This is pre-wrath theology, and I'll close with this. 7th trumpet announces Christ's reign, God's intensified wrath, but it's not the rapture. The rapture occurs earlier, after the 6th seal's cosmic disturbances, and before God's wrath begins. The 7th trumpet leads into the bowl judgments and Christ's second coming. And we'll stop there with our eschatology study. That'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. These are the live internet studies brought to you week after week by myself, Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. I'm a Torah teacher at Congregation Keilat Tnuva, The Harvest in Thornton, Colorado. Find us online at graftedin.com and join us in person for our live Sabbath services. At least, as I mentioned, join us online. You can see the link to the video right there on my screen as well. These live internet studies are a part of my own Torah teaching ministry, which parks itself on the web at tetzetorah.com. That's tetzetorah.com. I'd love to have you join me at my own home personal website there and browse around and take a look through all the commentaries that you see on my screen right now as well. I also have a YouTube channel that I'd be delighted if you popped in and took a look around there as well. youtube.com/C/Tetze Torah Ministries. If you do hit my website, my YouTube channel there, be sure to take notice that I update the site essentially daily, uploading videos daily. Make sure then to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, leave thumbs up for all the videos that you like. Leave me some comments and questions about things that you have your own thoughts on. And be sure to share the content with your other friends and family members in your social media circles, okay? Just some brief important details. If you'd like to join us for our live studies, be sure to get access to Skype somehow. If you're on my website right now during the live study and you click on that blue Skype link, it'll actually open up Skype on your browser and you can join us right there. We engage in live Q&A after the study is over, opening up the microphones and such, and it's exclusive to the live studies. But if you're not able to join us, take one last moment to scroll to the very bottom of my website where you can see some Hebrew writing in the black section down there and prayerfully consider partnering with me to take the Torah and the gospel around the world. You can click on the little yellow donate button and bless me that way with your financial gifts and contributions. And I'm so blessed to be able to be in a place where I can receive your generous gifts. Thank you to all of those who have given in the past and are continuing to give. I'm so thrilled to be on the receiving end of your generosity. And as I always say, be blessed as you seek to be a blessing to others. Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Let's take these 30 minutes and look at this topic, which is apologetic in nature. It is taking Trinitarian-leaning verses and defending them against the attacker known as biblical Unitarianism. So, what does biblical Unitarian believe? Well, we'll get to that in a moment, but what I'm working from is biblicalunitarian.com, and they're going to be presenting their position of Micah 5 verse 2, I believe it is. And in that passage, they're going to take the position that Jesus is not this eternal, pre-existent being that existed from way back in time and is now being prophesied to come onto Israel's scene. What they do is they work from the hermeneutic principle that I've highlighted on the screen, which is that there are numerous verses in the Bible that explain the nature of God and the nature of His Son. They say it this way: the following are clear explanations of the verses in the Bible that Trinitarians have sometimes used in attempts to quote-unquote prove the Trinity and to substantiate that Jesus is God. Since there are an overwhelming number of clear verses about Jesus Christ's identity and His distinction from God, and since God's Word has no contradictions, these comparatively few verses must fit with the many clear verses, and in their opinion, they absolutely do. So that's their hermeneutic that they're working from. What does biblicalunitarian.com believe? I've created this short little summary file to explain their belief. I've explained their beliefs in previous studies, and also when it comes to their position on Micah 5:2, which I'm going to show you in a moment. I've explained that, and I've read it and detailed it in previous studies. You have to go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Tetze Torah Ministries and look at or if you're watching this video, just click on the little thumbnail that shows my icon of my YouTube channel and look at the series of teachings that are being followed in this particular set on Micah 5:2. Go back to video number 1 of the Micah commentary, which isn't very far back. It's only about we're only on part 4 or 5 or something like that, 6 or 7, not very far in yet. So go back to part 1 and I'll explain. I've had people write into me and say, Ariel, how come you're not explaining biblical Unitarian's position? You're jumping right into your position. We want to know what they believe first. I explained theirs already, right? I'm trying to shorten the studies instead of reading theirs over and over again. But here's what they believe as far as Trinitarian topics and discussions. BiblicalUnitarian.com presents the Father as the sole true God. The Son is the human Messiah distinct from God, and the Holy Spirit is either another name for God the Father or the divine power bestowed upon believers. That's basically the way they view the three topics that we Trinitarians call Trinity. Okay, so here's the verse in question, read from the NIV version of BiblicalUnitarian.com's website, Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. Everything really kind of rises or falls on the final sentence, the final clause, whose origins are from old, from ancient times, right? This ruler of Israel. What does it mean that his origins are from old, from ancient times? I decided I'd let Copilot, which is built into Edge browser, over you can see on my screen here. I thought I'd let them explain this for a moment. Let me see if I can blow up just that part. Nope, it blew it up for me, but not for you guys in YouTube land. Well, actually, man, maybe it did blow up in YouTube land, but maybe just not for you guys in Skype land. So let me blow that up again. What they say is, what I'm doing is I'm showing you Skype's explanation, a summary basically of what what Biblical Unitarian believes. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. Oops, let's get some more of that. There we go. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. This is what Copilot has to say. For those of you who are in my Skype class, look over to the right side of the screen. It still looks small to you, but on my screen, trust me, it looks big, which means it's blown up on my screen recorder for my YouTube people. The interpretation of Micah 5:2. The verse is often interpreted by some Trinitarians as evidence for the eternal preexistence of Jesus. However, the article argues that the terms used in Micah 5:2 do not point to eternality, but rather to Israel's historical past and God's promises to David. So there is your explanation of what Biblical Unitarian believes. Now let's jump right into my refutation. We only scratched the surface of this 2 weeks ago before we went into our Purim break. So I've just backed up into the beginning heading of what I'm calling my brief exegesis of Micah 5:2 in the Hebrew Tanakh and its Christological significance. This is part of a larger essay that I've already discussed different standard Christian Trinitarian perspectives from three very well-known and well-trusted doctors of theology, Dr. Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Brown, Dr. James White, and then a Pastor John Piper. So I called that section 3 Docs and a Pastor. So we already went through all that. Now we're into looking at my own brief foray into the Hebrew and its Christological significance. We started into this 2 weeks ago, but I'll pick it up again. So we got Micah 5:2, which reads as follows in the Hebrew. And the reason I'm bringing the Hebrew in this point in time is because Biblical Unitarian makes it one of their main points to highlight the Hebrew of the last clause, which is going to be that part right there. But the entire Hebrew verse reads, Va'ata Beit Lachem, I'm sorry, let's start, Va'ata Beit Lachem Ephratah Ze'ir Lichot Ba'alfei Yehuda Mimcha Liyetze Lichot Moshel B'Yisrael. And now this final clause, the one that I just highlighted for you in blue, Umotza Otaiv Mikedem Mimei Olam. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight, basically we're going to talk about this phrase, which I've highlighted for you in blue right now, Umotza Otaiv. Then we're going to look at Mimei, and we're going to look at Olam. Mikedem, we're going to look at that very briefly, but that's not the focus, because Biblical Unitarian didn't highlight it as well. But let's first jump into a translation. This is the over 100-year-old 1917 Jewish Publication Society, that's JPS, translation of this particular verse, which reads similar to a KJV translation. It's got the Old English in it. It reads, quote, But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which art little to be among the thousands of Judah, out of thee shall come forth unto me, and the me is capitalized because it's God speaking, That is to be the ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from ancient days. Okay, so the question really, again, is centered around this particular ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from ancient days. Either A, it's referring to David or a progeny of David who would come onto the scene later on. So it's connected to not just one of David's sons who would sit on the throne, right? Following after his father king, David. So this would make him a rightful ruler, a king. It's either one of these guys, Hezekiah or someone like that. Or B, it's one of these guys who's really, really old, right? A time traveler, guy who shows up in Israel's scene, but when he shows up in Israel, he's going to say, hey, guess what? I've been around for hundreds or thousands of years. Maybe not from eternity, but from old, right? From ancient days. I'm a pretty old guy, but I'm a time traveler. That's one possibility. Obviously, that's a nonsense possibility. No one's really kind of going along with that. Or the Christian Trinitarian position is that it's Jesus, but Jesus predates his own birth in Bethlehem. Biblical Trinitarians are Christians. They do believe this is Jesus, but they just are like, well, the goings forth from old and from ancient days is a reference either to promises made to David or the prophecy that goes back into David's lineage or something like that. So it's not really the person who's from old. The word goings there, the mikedem part, the umotzotai part, is a reference, they say, to his reputation, the promise, something like that. All right, let's read my own exegesis, because we didn't get very far into this 2 weeks ago. Exegesis of key words and phrases. The biblical Unitarian argument, let me do my little highlight thing. The biblical Unitarian argument centers around 3 Hebrew phrases, so allow me to isolate each of them phrase by phrase for a moment, and this is where they're going to get their most mileage. Number 1, motza'otaiv, translated as his origins or his goings forth. Number 2, mikedem, translated as from before or from long ago. And number 3, mimei olam, translated as from eternity or from ancient days. So this is where a biblical Unitarian tries to convince us that these phrases are not an expression of eternality. Let's see what I have to say about that. The biblical Unitarian view argues that these 3 key terms point to Israel's historical past, not eternity. However, from a Trinitarian perspective, these phrases are indeed indicative of the Messiah's preexistence and eternal nature. I'm not really refuting, I'm not really providing any form of explanation of the passage so much as I'm just refuting them right now. I'm only providing an assertion, not really a refutation. However, what I do go on to say is, let's reincorporate these 3 phrases back into the verse as a whole, provide a short summary interpretation, and then we'll continue to examine the wider context. I'm going a bit quickly because this is kind of review. Okay, so I have the first phrase. We have motza'otaiv mikedem mimei olam, which I translated as whose origin is from old, from ancient days. So the phrase mimei olam, so I'm skipping over that part for a moment. This phrase, mimei olam, from ancient days, is significant. I go on to say that the term olam refers to eternity. Now I'm beginning to provide a bit of refutation, okay? I'm moving from assertion to refutation. The term, the phrase mimei olam, from ancient days, contains the term olam. And this term olam does refer to eternity or ancient times, but it's only from context. Its use in the Tanakh often carries the connotation of something beyond the temporal, sometimes implying an eternal existence. So context does demand if it's referring to just a long time ago or if it's referring to eternity. Look at this quote from inclusion of Psalm 90 verse 2. I updated this from last time. Last time it didn't have the Hebrew in there, but I put it in this time. Psalm 90 verse 2 reads, quote, "Before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth and the world." And then notice the underlined clause, "even from everlasting to everlasting," which in Hebrew would be umei olam ad olam. So even from everlasting to everlasting, and then the verse concludes by saying, "You are God." Now, I realize I've jumped out of the context of Micah to look at another verse that uses the same wording as Micah. And therefore, what I'm not saying is that just because the book of Psalms uses the word olam in the context of eternity, because clearly the context is God Almighty, I'm not saying that that automatically means that Micah's use of the same Hebrew term olam must mean eternity as well. I'm not saying that. That would be cherry picking and committing a fallacy of conflating the same Hebrew word across multiple passages, which is something we don't want to do. We don't want to cherry pick, and we don't want to take a word that's in passage A and automatically assign that meaning to passage B just because it's the same Hebrew word. Many Bible students make this mistake. Don't make that mistake. Each word has its own context, and there could be a range of meanings, a nuance, kind of like a meta-narrative that's created by the different words or similar words in different passages by different authors across different eras that are being used in slightly different ways. So I'm aware of that. However, what I do go on to say is, and again, this is review, so I'm not going to get too pointed at this point. This phrase here, when we talk about olam, this points to God's eternal nature, emphasizing that he is not bound by time. And so when Micah describes the ruler from Bethlehem as having origins from of old, right, the olam part, mime olam, it strongly suggests a timeless pre-existent figure. It's not a slam dunk. Right? I can't say definitely because olam means eternity in Psalms that, it must mean it means it in Micah. No, I'm not going to fall for that trap either. But it does strongly suggest a timeless pre-existent figure, which fits with Trinitarian Christology, where the second person of the Trinity, the Son, is understood as eternally pre-existent before his incarnation. So it means that there's a possibility that Micah could have mean this. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because sometimes I hear non-Trinitarians say there is no way that the Old Testament could have been hinting at Jesus being eternally existent, or it's just impossible. They discount it altogether. And I'm saying, we do have the possibility, because within this particular word, which does show up in Micah, we have a possible nuance, because the word does show up elsewhere, and in other verses, it clearly means eternally. So that creates the possibility. I'm not saying it's a slam dunk, but again, you have to work with what you've got. And so both of us are in a position where we've got to realize that, yes, it flips the other way as well. They could say, well, just like it's possible that it means eternally, maybe it's also possible it just means a really old guy, or a guy whose promises go really back far in time. Yeah, I recognize that as well, but follow with me, okay? Let's keep going to the one of the other Hebrew words that's in the promise in Micah 5:2, ruler, which is Moshael. The term Moshael, ruler or dominion, indicates one who has authority and power. I go on to say that this is a kingly figure, and the use of the term strengthens the messianic expectations associated with this passage. Again, we're talking about Micah 5:2, which Biblical Unitarian says does not refer to an eternal Messiah, but unlike Rabbinic Judaism, and this is a very important unlike that I want you to catch in case you didn't know, Biblical Unitarian who's non-Trinitarian, they do hold that this passage is speaking of Jesus, which separates Biblical Unitarian from Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism just throws this out altogether, right? No, that's not Jesus. That can't be him. It's some other character. But Biblical Unitarians embraces the fact that this is Jesus, which I applaud. All right, so I go on to say that a ruler coming from Bethlehem points to a Davidic lineage, but the claim that his origin is from old, quote-unquote, distinguishes his ruler from all other earthly kings, implying a divine nature. So I think that, again, this gives us room as Trinitarians to begin to build our interpretation that this is referring to Jesus himself. It is not in isolating the verse from other verses, in other words, cherry picking, that we say, boom, we got it. Slam dunk, case closed. Jesus is this ruler. Jesus is the Moshael. Jesus is this one who's from eternity, right? It doesn't work that way. Rather, this is what is part of, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago, it's what we should understand as a meta-narrative, a a larger picture created by the Bible as a whole, when we take verses strewn across the landscape of the Bible in different books written by different authors in different eras, but when we get to the time period when Jesus hit the scene, revealed himself as who he was, and then we got the apostolic writers, the apostolic scriptures writing and recording what Jesus said, all of this under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we end up with this giant composite, what I called last week a case file, that's built of individual little pieces that have now been researched and brought all back together so that we can see who this person is. We can build what we might call, in kind of criminal terminology, our profile of this individual, who Jesus is, right? We're not saying he's a criminal, but it's similar to what police officers or investigators do, or some private detectives or whatever. They build all these clues based on different pieces of evidence that they found at the crime scene here and there, and they're chasing after who might be the killer, and they're creating a case file on what they believe who the identity of the killer is, and then they finally don't realize who the identity is until they get that final last clue. Well, we're building our case file of this, the identity of this person known as Messiah, based on all these clues that are strewn throughout the Bible, and Micah 5:2 is just one of those clues. So we are absolutely not cherry picking, okay? We Trinitarians. Let's keep going. For Trinitarian Christology, this is significant, right? Talking about this ruler whose origins are from old. This is significant because it suggests that the Messiah is not merely a human descendant of David, but one whose authority transcends earthly kingship. Again, I'm not saying this is a slam dunk. I'm simply saying that it gives us the license and the warrant for making the claims that we make. It would be different if we were, to be absurd. What if I was claiming that Jesus was a woman, right? As absurd as that sounds. I've heard some people say that, God is a woman, or God is genderless, God is an it. What if I were to get, I think there's like a gender neutral Bible out there, or some nonsense Bible. Absolutely blasphemous. And it would be a blasphemous thing to say that the Messiah was a woman. I don't have anything against women, but I'm trying to bring up a point. What if I were to say that Jesus was a woman? Right? What if this were the claim that I was making as a Christian? Jesus is a woman. Well, right away you'd have to stop and say, okay, Ariel, Jesus is a woman. But what do you have any verse that supports that claim? And I turn to some of these, like the Gospel of Thomas, or all these the Syllabine oracles, or this esoteric writing that I found that somebody found in an ancient cave that was buried for 2,000 years, that was finally on earth, and it's the lost gospel. This says that Jesus is a woman, or some goofy thing like that. The point is that everyone would be like, excuse me, everyone would be like, automatically, there's just no way that could be true, because there's no biblical passages that would even lend any credence to that claim. Well, that's the point I'm trying to bring up, is that it's not like we Trinitarians are coming out from left field, like with some claim that absolutely can't be supported by any biblical verse. On the other hand, when the biblical Unitarians come along and say Jesus is a man, we Trinitarians say, yes, we agree. And, right? We do agree he's a man, because there are numerous verses that explain that Jesus is a man. The point that we say to them is that it's not that you're using verses out of context, it's that you're not following through with the remainder of the profile. Keep reading the rest of the story. Keep reading the rest of the Bible, and you'll see that Jesus is not merely man. All right, let's keep going. Now we got Bethlehem Ephratah, right? Bethlehem Ephratah. The location, Bethlehem, is emphasized here in this part of the prophecy, I say, as being, quote, too little to be among the clans of Judah. This is what the verse reads. Despite its insignificance and size, it will be the birthplace of the great ruler. Later on, we're going to see that Pastor Piper does a great job of explaining, of giving us something that is a highlight for this particular, what he believes is something that highlights why perhaps God chose Bethlehem as the birthplace for the Messiah. This aligns with the humble nature. No, I think I'm doing it right here. This aligns, I say, but I think I got this from Piper, so I can't claim ownership of it. I didn't come up with this idea, but I agree with it. This interpretation of, or implication, I believe, that, in other words, we're asking, why, God, did you choose Bethlehem? Why not choose, Jerusalem itself? Why not choose some great, magnificent city and bring Messiah in with all kinds of fanfare and big announcements? I mean, you brought him in on the backward side of Israel in this really tiny little place where no one's, ever going to look for him. But let's keep reading. This aligns, I say, with the humble nature of the Messiah's incarnation as emphasized in the Gospels. And so I go on to say that the term Ephratah ties the town to the historical context of the Davidic line, as this is the same Bethlehem where David was born, right? If we read 1 Samuel 16:1, I believe that Ephratah, if I remember, is a name for the town. Wait, I suppose I could look it up here real quick. Give me a moment. Let's just pull up. I should have had this earlier. 1 Samuel 16:1. Just to make sure. All right. And so Samuel goes to Bethlehem. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him from being king of Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse. Who's Jesse? Jesse is the father of David. Jesse the Bethlehemite, because I have chosen a king for myself among his sons. Okay, it didn't say anything about Ephrathah, but I apologize. I'll look it up later and find out why I made particular mention there. But let's keep going in my essay here. This smallness, the fact that he's born in a very insignificant town, it contrasts with the greatness of the ruler prophesied, right? If you notice, he's this ruler from this very small town, but he's going to be the ruler over Israel. That's my point, the contrast. It contrasts with the greatness of the ruler prophesied, foreshadowing the paradoxical nature of the Messiah's first coming, where he is both humble and divine. All right, let's see. I have got 5 minutes. I'm going to keep plugging along if you guys are okay with that. Key points of theological significance for Trinitarian Christology. Number 1, preexistence of the Messiah. The phrase from old, mime olam, directly supports the concept of the preexistence of the Messiah. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. It's not a slam dunk argument, but because of the nuance of the word olam, which in some verses is eternity, it's not saying that the verse here absolutely cannot be eternity. Right? That's my point. It could be. But either way, this concept of eternity directly supports the concept of a preexistence of the Messiah, a core tenet of Trinitarian doctrine. And that's the point I'm trying to bring out. The Messiah, I go on to say, as the second person of the Trinity, existed with the Father and the Holy Spirit before creation. Right? Compare from John 1 through 3. And then I already talked about this particular psalm, but I'm highlighting it again because we're in a different section. Psalm 90 verse 2 clearly states that God is eternal, and the use of the same phrase in Micah connects the eternal existence of the Messiah to the eternal God. Is that a slam dunk argument? No. But yes, it means that this could be, and I believe it is, hinting at the fact that Jesus is this eternal Messiah. Remember, I'm getting my Trinitarian theology not just from the experiential Trinitarian records that were recorded by the experiential Trinitarians that the disciples became once they encountered the Lord himself and wrote about what he did, right? In other words, what turned into what we now call the New Testament, what I call the Apostolic Scriptures. I'm not just getting it from that, but I'm also realizing the fact that God, from times past, hid the incarnation of his Son from the Old Testament writers and readers, only to be revealed later on. But it's important for us to acknowledge that hidden revelation is not the same as non-existent revelation. And thus we end up with this phrase, mystery. I am a proud Mysterian theologian. I am a Mysterian theologian. What does that mean? It means I believe that God hid truths in the Old Testament only to reveal them in the New Testament, even though some of them are still mysterious. But they were present. And this means that Jesus didn't just suddenly become this God-man of the New Testament in the incarnation. He didn't just become God from the New Testament era. Rather, the Old Testament always had him as very God, veiled in flesh, and he just showed up as in theophanies and Christophanies, angel of the Lord, captain of the Lord's host, things like that. Three men showing up outside of Abraham's tent, and one of them is Yahweh. That type of thing. We had Jesus showing up in his pre-incarnate form, but we didn't know him as Messiah back then. God knew, but we didn't know, right? The angel of the Lord is God, but is a separate representation of God, a figure of God, not a manifest, not a, what was I going to say? I was going to say a mode of God. It's not a mode of God. The angel of the Lord is actually a separate person, a personage, a figure, and yet it's the messenger of God and is very God. I mean, it's a mystery. That's why I say I can't explain it. So, looking at Psalm 92, we have warrant for that. Number 2, divine and human nature. This is how we Trinitarians explain this incarnation reality, this hypostatic nature, the fact that Jesus can be very God and yet be truly human at the same time. He's both divine and human. The contrast between the smallness of Bethlehem and the great ruler who will come from there reflects the dual nature of the Messiah, fully divine, fully human, right? The hypostatic union. His divine nature is hinted at by the eternal origins, while its humanity is reflected in his birth in a humble town. Again, I got that those statements basically from Pastor John Piper. And then I think I'll read this last point, number 3, and then we'll draw our study to close. Number 3, Messiah's eternal kingship. The term ruler that I mentioned earlier, Moshael, in Micah 5:2 suggests the Messiah's eternal kingship as his dominion is not limited by time or space. This connects to the New Testament understanding of Christ's reign, where he is described as reigning eternally, right? Luke 1:33, Revelation 11:15, which is consistent with the Trinitarian view of Christ's divine kingship. So the numbers basically are functioning under the key points. It's kind of like a summary. The key points of the theological significance for Trinitarian Christology are: number 1, the preexistence of the Messiah; number 2, his divine and human nature; and number 3, his eternal kingship. And that's why I'm using the words that are found in the Micah 5:2 passage to bolster my argument. So we're going to leave off here. We'll pick up next week. There are some additional, you know what? Let me read this last thing. Some additional Tanakh references. I've got about another 60 seconds left, and I don't want to break it off here because I've got a full section break coming up next. In Isaiah 9:6-7, in this passage, the Messiah is described as, quote, the everlasting Father, right? The Avi Ad from the Hebrew. And I say as a Trinitarian that this suggests a divine eternal nature. And this helps you to see that I'm not cherry picking. This helps you to see that this idea that we Trinitarians describe Jesus as a divine figure is not only rooted in Micah 5:2. Rather, it's what I mentioned earlier. It's found in other passages of the Tanakh, but it was hidden from the writer's perspective. It was hidden from the reader's perspective. It was hidden in mystery until God chose to reveal this truth of incarnation in the time period of the apostolic scriptures. So when we go back to passages like Isaiah 9, which we've looked at on this particular YouTube channel, we can see that there are suggestions of the Messiah's eternal nature here. The fact that he's called the everlasting Father. This is not to be confusing the Son with the Father. I'm not saying the Son is the Father by using Isaiah 9:6. I can hear the objectors, my detractors, typing away on their keyboards right now, right? Clack, 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 tick, 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 tick. No, I am not, as a Trinitarian, saying that the Son is the Father. I'm not confusing the Avi Ad of Isaiah with the Son, who Jesus is. Rather, without getting too deep into it, suffice to say, the everlasting Father here in Isaiah is referring to the King of Israel being viewed as the Father of the nation of Israel. And so the Father of eternity, the everlasting Father, the Avi Ad, is this Father who will be the Father to the nation of Israel. King David was seen as a father. If you guys want support verses for that, or rabbinic quotes that kind of bring this concept in, bring this out, the one I'm describing right now, I'm not going to do it right now, but if you write in or you post a comment below, if you watch the video, like, all right, I want to see support for that. Where you're getting that, Ariel, that the Messiah is supposed to be the Father of the nation of Israel. I'll provide that later on, but that's what's going on here. It's not to confuse the Son with the Father. We're not pulling some oneness Pentecostal trick where we're saying that the Son is the Father. Not doing that. All right, so I continue. But this verse and the theology of the verse aligns with the eternal origin of the ruler in Micah 5:2. And then we've got another passage that we have looked at on this YouTube channel as well, and I'll close with this. Proverbs 8:22 and 23. In describing wisdom, the passage states, quote, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth." Notice that the language in Proverbs is quite explicit, and it does not allow for some excuse that the figure spoken of in Proverbs is simply a really old guy. You know what I'm talking about? Like the objectors, those who object to me turning the figure in Micah 5:2 into an eternal guy instead of just a really old guy, like, or a promise going back to David from a long time ago, like biblical Unitarian objects, right? So you got the people who object to Trinitarian theology by saying, well, every time it says olam doesn't mean it's eternity. It could just mean really old people, or a promise going really far back into Israel's history, or something to that effect. But when you get to the book of Proverbs, if you look at the language, I don't see how there's a way that we can say that the figure or the focal point of the writer of the Proverbs here is referring to just some really old person. The language there doesn't seem to allow for that. The elaboration of, before his works of old, from everlasting, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. It's like he's trying to emphasize that whatever he's talking about goes all the way back to before there was any creation. And whatever he's talking about here coexists with very God. Right? The Lord, that's the tetragrammaton name of Yahweh there. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. And so we've talked about how the fact that numerous Christian authors have gone on to believe that this figure in the book of Proverbs here is none other than Jesus himself, the Word who became flesh in John 1:1. So we've done a study on Proverbs on this particular YouTube channel, so go check it out. But I go on to say that this also echoes the eternal preexistence of the Messiah, who's identified as the divine Word in the New Testament. And there it is, John 1:1. Okay, so we're going to stop there for tonight. Next week, we'll start to turn to some more exegesis. But this time, we're going to do it in the form of exegesis of Micah 5:2 in the Greek Septuagint, the LXX, and its Christological significance. So you want to catch that next week. But in the meantime, while you're waiting, don't forget to watch this video. Go back and watch previous studies, the ones that you missed over the 2-week break or whatever, or the Purim break. Go back and get caught up on where we're going in this particular study, so that you're able to follow along with the future studies that I'm putting together. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. Let's close in prayer. Abba, I bless your name, and I'm so grateful to be alive at this time. It's an exciting time to be living in, but at the same time, it's kind of frightful, knowing what's coming around the corner and could be coming around the corner very, very soon. But my hope and trust is anchored in you, Lord, and therefore I have nothing to fear. So, Lord, keep us strong, keep us faithful, keep us watchful and waiting for your return. Help us to continue to press in, studying your words, soaking up your spirit, being witnesses of your great kingdom and of your great name, and continue to help us to demonstrate this love to one another, and not to just trample on each other just because we have differences of opinions. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to share my thoughts with the students. Be with them as we go throughout this week. Keep them safe, keep them blessed, and bring us all back together next week. And we'll be careful to give you the praise and glory. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.